Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to first of all thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about the work that we are doing at the theory division here at CFEL DESY, and for putting together this nice workshop with so kind of different backgrounds from the people. And the first thing that I would like to do is to acknowledge, oh, 1 second, this should be, yeah. So I would like to acknowledge the co-workers of what I will present. Cheng Li, he's a PhD student. Lamin Majed is a postdoc in our group, and of course, Robin Sandra, you know them, you know him. Okay, so let me just first of all, in a couple of slides, give a little bit of background of basically the molecular Hamiltonian and what we understand by non-adiabatic couplings in molecules, because the audience is very heterogeneous, and of course, to some of you, this is already very trivial. So this would be the full molecular Hamiltonian. You see here the nuclear kinetic energy, electronic kinetic energy, electron-electron interaction, electron-nuclear interaction, and nuclear-nuclear interaction. And this can be written in this way, in which all these terms are collected into what is called this electronic Hamiltonian, and then the kinetic energy here. And if one solves the time-independent Schrödinger equation with this Hamiltonian, then one has what is called the Coulomb nuclear Schrödinger equation, and one gets then potentials that depend on the position of the nuclei. And these potentials, the so-called potential energy surfaces, this is very much at the heart of our understanding of chemistry, of the motion of molecules, of their dynamics. And we can think of molecules as moving on, so basically the nuclei, moving on top of these potential energy surfaces. This is possible because in many situations, the kinetic energy of the nuclei is much smaller than the energies in this Hamiltonian here. So this is pretty much like a small perturbation, and then this separation makes sense. These functions that we get, so these electronic wave functions in which the positions of the nuclei enter as parameters, they can be then used to define an ansatz, in which again, well, these are these functions where the nuclei enter parametrically, and these are the nuclear wave functions. And if we plug this into the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, into the full time-dependent Schrödinger equation, then we will get one term in which basically here we have the kinetic energy of the nuclei, these potentials in which the nuclei move. So this is the potential energy operator, and then we have these coupling terms here, which are related to the kinetic energy of the nuclei, basically. If we forget about this, or we just neglect it, then we will have this picture in which the nuclei move on independent potential energy surfaces. And this is true in many situations, but there will be situations in which these couplings are essential. Basically, and we'll see this in a second. So these couplings, they take this form. These are differential operators that diverge at the points of electronic degeneracy. We can see that this basically, well, this is the scalar coupling. This is very often neglected. And basically, this term is the one that, if we see its dependence, it's basically the gradient of this operator and then sandwiched between two electronic wave functions, and depends on the difference. So if we have a point in which two potential energy surfaces are degenerate, basically these couplings diverge. And this gives rise to the concept of conical intersections. So this would be one of such points, or seams. I mean, these conical intersections are in a space which is n minus 2 dimensional, where n is the internal degrees of freedom of the molecule. So if you have 2 degrees of freedom, then they are really a point. And when the nuclei move close to these areas, close to these points of intersection, then these terms are important, and they induce transitions between the different electronic states. And this is then basically, yeah, there is a lot of photochemistry which is related to phenomena basically of electronic decay through conical intersections. Okay. So if we want to treat these situations theoretically, if we do quantum dynamics, and I will show quantum dynamical examples and also examples based on classical mechanics. In quantum mechanics, what one usually does, I don't want to go into many details here, but one takes this representation of the Schrödinger equation, and one transforms it to a form that is called diabatic, in which these differential operators are transformed into potential operators. And there are different ways to do this, and I will just briefly show it later for an example. And the idea is that one has a position-dependent transformation that transforms us from these adiabatic potentials to the adiabatic representation. This is a much nicer representation. Here there are no diverging couplings, and this is much more adequate than for quantum dynamics, because basically the wave packets, they are spread over all space, and they would see the divergence points, and this would make lots of problems. So this representation is much better for quantum dynamics. I will also show results based on what is called surface hopping simulations. I also don't want to go into many details, but another way to deal with these problems is just to use classical trajectories for the nuclei and account for the transitions between the different electronic states. This means that one is solving nuclear dynamics, so classical dynamics for the electrons, where one gets the force as the gradient of these potential energy surfaces, and then these potential surfaces can be obtained by any quantum dynamics method, electronic structure method, multi-configurational methods, or for example for the ground state, Hartree-Fock or DFT would be adequate. And then all this goes into different methods to treat how the trajectories jump from one trajectory to the other. One scheme that we have been using is the Landau-Zener scheme, which is quite simple because it depends only on the potentials and on the velocities of the nuclei on the potentials. Now we have also other methods implemented. But as I said, I mean, I don't want to go into much detail. Just mention that when we do these kind of simulations, then we use the adiabatic representation, because then these potentials are directly obtained from quantum chemistry codes, and this is the natural representation when one deals with classical trajectories. Okay, so now that I have given a little bit the theoretical background of what we are doing, let me just show again. I mean, this picture was this morning in the talk of Joachim Ulrich here. So the calculations that we do are motivated by experiments done at FLASH, and FLASH is this linear FEL, which has these operation parameters. And Joachim already motivated why it's interesting to look at molecules at FLASH. I would just add up that basically with FLASH, what we accomplish is we do ionizations that are mostly valence ionizations, and with these we have molecules where I would still say they still behave in a way that one can think about chemistry. So one removes an outer electron and this molecule will move. So we can use pump to induce chemistry and then maybe also probe it with FLASH. When we remove very deep electrons, actually this will cause Coulomb explosions. This is not so much in the chemical regime. But with FLASH, we can really study chemistry, outer valence chemistry. So Joachim briefly mentioned this morning acetylene. This is one of the works, this is one of the molecules that we've been working on. I will only present it here in this transparency and then move to another topic. What they did is, as he introduced this morning, they used FLASH to remove an outer valence electron. Then they looked, they waited for a certain time until the proton moves, and then they broke the system again with another pulse and looked at the occurrence of fragments that contain the two protons on the same side of the molecule. And then they concluded that when one excites into this cationic state, or when ionizes into this cationic state, the system undergoes ultra-fast isomerization. This is what we also see from our simulations, but also a conical intersection is involved that will bring the system down again to the ground state, to the cationic ground state. And this we have simulated, and basically we came up with a picture in which these two elements go hand in hand. And we are still improving on this. We still working on the problem, and there will be more papers to come on this in the near future. But I would like to discuss today about another system that has been studied at FLASH, and as you will see later, I think this comes very nicely into the topic of this workshop, because we will see correlations between electron holes and protons moving. This is an experiment that we were also, Joachim was involved. This is by the group of Andreas Wolf in Heidelberg. And what they did at FLASH is they took this molecule, the protonated water dimer. This is a stable system in the gas phase. It's a closed shell system. It's just two water molecules with an extra proton. And they ionize this system with flash. It's written here. And then they look at basically the fragmentation channels that one gets. This is the fragmentation channel that is seen with the largest probability. There are also other fragmentation channels that are seen. And in these experiments, there was no time resolution. This is only a one-photon experiment. The pulse was attenuated to make sure that one is not doubly ionizing, and that's it. They just ionize and look at the fragments. Now, let's look at the energy levels. Basically, we have here these outer valence orbitals, these outer valence states. We are concentrating basically on these states here. I will show the orbitals that are involved later. There is a gap of about 5 electron volts with these two states here, so they are not they cannot really talk to each other in terms of couplings. So you can see here the possible decay channels once you have ionized. You can go into hydronium plus protonated water, or you can go into this free body channel up here. It's easy to estimate the energies of these channels. This is just still in the ground state of the system. If you separate basically if you just pull away the two waters, one will take the proton, the other one will just remain a neutral water, and this is associated with an energy of about 1.5 electron volts. If you include here the ionization potential of water, you end up with the energy of this channel, about 14 electron volts. And if you look at what is the proton affinity of water, then you can estimate, or you can get basically this energy. This is about 21.2 electron volts, and this would still be below this second state here. So we are going to center on the dynamics induced by ionizing into these states. And in principle, this channel seems to be open, and we'll see later what happens with this channel. Okay, so if you see, these are basically the orbitals that contain the hole, the electron hole in the leading configuration for the electronic states, and these orbitals have been computed for a geometry of the system that corresponds to the ground state. So this would be the proton in the middle of the two water molecules, and the oxygen-oxygen distance about 2.5 angstrom. And you can see the topology of the potential G surface as a function of the position of the proton, as a function of the inter-oxygen distance. And you can see here these regions of intersection that, so this is basically conical intersections, one here and one here. And this is related to the fact that when you remove an electron from one of the water molecules, if you move the proton to one side, basically the hole tends to localize at the other side. So this is the reason why these two curves cross in the middle. If you go to this upper potential here, this is a potential G surface that corresponds to a state in which, well, this is again the electron hole, and here you are removing the electron from the orbitals that form the hydrogen bond. So basically now you have an electron hole which is around the central proton, so you have to think that there is a positive charge associated to this proton, and then you have an electron hole surrounding it. And when you do that, the proton moves in a more or less shallow potential, and at some point, if the proton moves enough to basically to one of the sides, it will again, so this state will become unstable, and you will have a conical intersection, and basically the charge will then localize. So this is a conical intersection related to the fact that when the proton moves to one side, in the end, the hole tends to localize in the other water molecule. So we have here an interplay between the position of the proton and where the holes are located. For this, we have done quantum dynamics on top of these potential G surfaces. So basically, this would be the set of 15 internal degrees of freedom of the protonated water dimer, and we have selected a subset of 7 degrees of freedom. These are the ones that in the ground state have the lowest frequencies. So basically, we are simulating with the coordinates proton between the two water molecules, proton out of the axis, oxygen-oxygen distance, internal rotation of the water molecule, and these vacuum, so basically these pyramidalization angles of the water molecules. And these coordinates are just frozen at their ground state equilibrium distances. Then the potential energy surface that we are using, we have computed at the CASA CF level. So this is a good correlated energy, so good correlated method for excited states. And we have done this in a subspace. And it's a scheme in which we have a low quality method for the whole space, and then a high quality method for a subspace. And in this way, we can get the whole potential in a 7-dimensional grid. All right. Then we need to take these potentials and bring them to the diabatic representation. I'm just going to skip through this quickly, but the main idea is that we use a diabatic representation that is forced to reproduce the adiabatic potentials in all regions of the potential energy surface. And this is because we have very large amplitude motions. And and this means that far from the conical intersections, we also need to reproduce the potential energy surfaces well. So this is basically how these potentials are constructed. But the main ingredient is we have a model for the conical intersections. We diagonalize this model. Then we get some potentials that we don't use for anything. We just use the transformation matrix, and then you take the true potentials and transform them back to the representation that we use for the dynamics. This has been already used in the past and works well. So let's have a look at the results. So now we start looking at adiabatic dynamics. This means we have the full Hamiltonian that I showed at the beginning, but now we switch off the couplings and start the quantum dynamics with the coupling switched off. And then we see that if we start from the lowest adiabatic state, we have a very fast Coulomb explosion. This is the Coulomb explosion channel. This is when the wave packet is placed under the conical intersection and just leaves very quickly. If we put the wave packet in the second state, so this means above the conical intersection, it will mostly stay, so the proton will stay localized in the middle, and there will be a small leak out, but very small. And basically, the proton stays in the central region. So if you remember, if you had the double cone, this means that the wave packet stays in the upper part of the double cone. And then if we put the wave packet in the third state of the cation, then it really doesn't move at all. It just stays there confined, and there is no Coulomb explosion. So from this, you can already see that in order for the system to dissociate and to find the Coulomb explosion panel, you need the diabatic, you need the non-adiabatic effects. So you need the coupling between the potential energy surfaces. Okay, now we use the full Hamiltonian, so the couplings are in now. And if we start from the lowest of the three states, then we have also a very fast Coulomb explosion. If we start from the second one, we also have a very fast Coulomb explosion. You see that basically the system is, the protons are going to one water molecule or to the other water molecule. If we start from the third state, then we have a certain probability that the proton remains at the center. And if you look at this is just a cut in a 2D space. These are 2D densities, but the other degrees of them are also there. If one looks at the full wave function, one sees that when the proton is here in the middle, actually it has left through the perpendicular direction. So this means that if one is in this state, the proton has a chance to leave perpendicular to the system, and this would be a three-body channel. So the one that I introduced at the very beginning. So it seems that if we start from the upper state, we have enough energy to leave through this three-body channel. Let me just show very quickly the photoionization spectrum that we could compute also from our calculations. So again, here are the potentials. And this is the full photoionization spectrum computed from the autocorrelation function of the quantum dynamical calculations. And we have these peaks. In order to assign them, what we did is we started the calculation again without couplings and looking at the spectra starting from every of these potentials. And you can see this very wide peak here corresponds to when the wave packet starts here on the red curve, so on the red potential. And this is the very fast, so this is a very fast Coulomb explosion. So there is no time to resolving any vibrational structure, and this is just a wide peak. This peak here corresponds to when one, and this, B and C corresponds to when one puts the wave packet on the green curve. And in this case, there is some chance of the wave packet to vibrate within this potential, and this will generate some vibrational structure. And this bump here corresponds to the little bit of leaking that was in this green curve that could live through here. And this peak here corresponds to when we put the wave packet here on the upper curve, and then it will vibrate here when we will see some vibrational structure, but that's it. So this is the photoionization spectrum. The good thing is that when discussing with experimentalists, with Andreas Wolf, now they want to do a new campaign of measurements in which way they will try to put the photon energy of flash as close as possible to here, so that they hopefully can record the photoionization spectrum by looking at the energy of the photoelectrons, and then we will see if our calculations agree with what they can measure. So this is a very useful information for the experimentalists working on the system. Okay. Now, is this the whole story, right? I mean, I just showed you that the three-body channel is open if we start from the upper potential. It seems that there is enough energy. So what we are doing is we are also working on classical approaches, because we want to go to larger systems. And since we have already these programs ready, we decided to run also classical trajectories on this system, in which you can also do the quantum dynamics. And here is the kinetic energy release calculated from these classical trajectories, starting also from different vibrational states. So let me just drive you shortly through this data. Here we have this curve is the kinetic energy release for a quantum dynamical calculation. We see that it is in good agreement with these upper curves, and this is the total energy of the two monomers. So basically these curves correspond to the sum of the vibrational energy of monomer 1, so all the energy of the vibrating molecule. This is the kinetic energy of the center of mass, so basically from the velocity of this water molecule moving in space, and this is then the same thing for monomer 2. And these curves here correspond to the kinetic energy only coming from the motion of the centers of mass. And we see that no matter from which electronic state we start, we end up with the same final velocity of the water molecules. But the internal energy content is very different. So when we start from this higher electronic state, then we get a much higher energy content. And this basically means that when we start from higher electronic states, there is a very fast energy transfer into vibrations, which is fast enough that the water molecules are still close to each other when this energy transfer has almost completed, and then they start to move away from each other. And the final velocity, the terminal velocity, let's say, in these electronic states then turns up to be the same. So this is a first indication that there is a very fast energy transfer from electronic degrees of freedom into vibrational degrees of freedom, and this is something that should be measurable experimentally. I mean, if the experimentals record kinetic energy releases, one should be able to see something like this. All right. Okay, so now let me show you. You may say, okay, you are comparing 7-dimensional quantum dynamics and full-dimensional classical dynamics, right? So the point is that in the classical dynamics calculations, we never saw the three-body channel. And the explanation is because the energy is taken so quickly by the water molecules, and there is not enough energy for the proton to live perpendicular. To investigate this, what we did is we did classical dynamics, but now with constraint, basically with constraints in the equations of motion. So basically using exactly the same model for the quantum dynamics and for the classical dynamics calculations. And what you will see here is a constrained classical dynamics starting from the second electronic state, and you see the proton moves, and the water molecules are totally rigid, and then the system now has enough energy to really live through the perpendicular. We had never seen this kind of channel when the water molecules can adapt to the, basically when the calculation is full dimensional and they can take vibrational energy from the system. Now here we will see exactly the same trajectory, but without constraints. And so the same initial conditions, but now the water molecules can start to vibrate, and you see that they are doing scissoring motions and vibrational motions, which are quite dramatic. So they have taken quite a lot of vibrational energy on the order of 1 to 2 EVs, and then there is no way for the three-body channel. So basically we come to the conclusion that we have this three-body fragmentation channel, which is energetically open. If you remember from the very beginning of the talk, this channel was open from the energy of the cationic state of, let's say, of the upper cationic state that we are considering, but there is no way to reach it kinetically. The energy flows too quickly into vibrations, and then this channel cannot be reached. So, okay. Now, the next molecule that we are considering is the trimer, and the reason for this is because we see already in the dimer this interplay between the proton moving to one direction, the electron hole moving into the other direction, and all these non-adiabatic effects that are involved in the curves crossing. With this system, then we want to continue. Basically, we want to generalize this and try to see generalities, and we want to even to do a bit larger clusters in the near future. But let me show you what we have on this model, in this molecule that we have started to work shortly. So now again, we have a set of orbitals that correspond to removing electrons from different parts of the system. So basically, at 16 electron volts, we would be removing electrons from these orbitals in the water molecules, in the external water molecules. Now a little bit higher, these are orbitals that are involved in the hydrogen bonding of the system, so they would come a bit deeper. Then we have this orbital that is sitting on the central water molecule, and this corresponds then to removing an electron from the place where the positive charge is already sitting in the ground state of the system. So if we look at the ground state, basically there is a positive charge density in the central water molecule, and this explains this higher ionization potential, and then this would be the final state. And we can now look at the potential energy surfaces as a function of the proton position along this axis for this system. And now we start to find here very interesting non-adiabatic effects. Okay, this is basically the two-dimensional potential that one obtains by moving these two protons and keeping the rest fixed. And we see here a mesh of curve crossings, and this is now just a cut in which we just move one of the two. And basically what we see here, this would be, for example, basically a cationic state of the system in which the electron has been removed from one of the external water molecules. And now we start to move the proton, for example, this proton in direction to this water molecule, and we will see that very quickly now we will go through a series of curve crossings, and this is basically now, okay, the proton comes closer. Now this state becomes unstable because this positive charge is approaching a place where there is already a positive charge. So now we have here a curve crossing, and then again and again and again, and at the end we have here, up here, we would have the positive charge here and this proton very close to this charge. So we see basically that the position of the proton is strongly coupled to what, to where basically the hole is more stabilized in the system. The same thing can be done by coming from up here. This would correspond to making the hole in the central water molecule. When the protons are still here, this has a very high energy, and as we move the proton away from the central water molecule, this diabatic state would be stabilized. You can see how nicely the adiabatic states reach these points of intersection. One can pretty much per hand diabatize in this system. We could go to the data and just reassign the points such that then we get diabatic curves. I mean, it's really a very dramatic example that I like a lot. Now what we can do is we can look at the dynamics. We have already a few hundreds of trajectories starting from different electronic states, but I just want to show one example in which we start the dynamics from the hole in the central water molecule, the one that is holding already the positive charge at the beginning, so the positive charge associated with the proton, and then we just let it go. Here I show the electronic population. This is an average over about 100 trajectories. So at the beginning, the whole electronic population corresponds to the electronic state that has this hole, and then it will decay very quickly. So in about less than 20 femtoseconds, this state is totally depopulated, and then other states will get populated and depopulated. We see here, and in the end, we end up pretty much basically in the ground electronic state of this cationic manifold. And this is something that happens in a time scale of about 50 femtoseconds, so very quick. And we just look now here at the dynamics. So as I said, remember the electronic hole starts here, and this is also where, let's say, the positive charge corresponding to the proton also is. And now this starts. So at the beginning, let's say the protons are trying to find their way through the crossings. And now we see that basically the system has decided that the excess proton localizes on this side and the electron hole localizes on this water molecule. We have, as I said, hundreds of trajectories, and one thing that is ahead of us in the next days is basically to analyze all these trajectories and look for other possible dissociation channels, and also look at what happens when we start from other electronic states. But this one is particularly interesting because of the fact that proton and electron hole are localized at the beginning in the same position. So with this, I reached the conclusions of the work. So we say that for these protonated water clusters, so they exhibit, upon ionization, strongly correlated electron hole and proton motions, which are coupled via non-adiabatic effects. We have also seen that non-adiabatic pathways are involved in the fragmentation of the clusters, and they channel the electronic excitation energy in an ultra-fast and efficient way into vibrational motion. I mean, we have seen that even they can quench channels that would be energetically open. We also see, I mean, what we are going to do in the future is look at larger clusters. So the question is, will they fragment, or will the two charges separate fast and far enough to avoid fragmentation? I mean, now we have just 2 or 3 water molecules, so it's quite clear that we have a very high positive charge density, and the system will mostly basically Coulomb explode. But we have enough water molecules. It can be that the proton and hole can move enough, so fast enough, into the, let's say, into the outer parts of the cluster, and then the system would remain stable. These are things that we want to find out. And basically what would be nice to have, as I said at the beginning, the experiments that have been conducted are not time dependent. There is no time information on these kind of systems. We are providing this via our simulations, but it would be nice to see experiments that can follow the coupled evolution of the electron hole and the excess proton in a time-resolved way. And with this, I have reached the end, and thank you very much for your attention.